Hello, everyone. Welcome to the It Hurts to Mom podcast. I'm Lauren Rose, and today we're talking about parenting after loss. Our guest is Michelle Valiukenas. Michelle, a dedicated mom, storyteller, and advocate, founded the Colette Louise Tisdahl Foundation with her husband after the loss of their angel daughter, Colette. Based in Glenview, Illinois, Michelle is a writer and speaker addressing topics like infertility, pregnancy loss, and maternal health. The foundation provides financial aid, education, and advocacy to support families navigating high-risk pregnancies, NICU stays, and loss. Michelle's mission is to create a world where every choice, parent, and family is supported and empowered. Welcome. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. And a great pronunciation of my last name. So
yeah, that's definitely an uncommon one, but I think that's cool. I love uncommon names, first names and last names and middle names, all of it.
For sure.
So tell us more about yourself and your experience with Colette.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm a mom of three, two angel babies, and my son, Elliot, who is going to be 4 in July. Surprisingly, don't know where that time went. Um, I think mine is a story that felt very uncommon, but I think unfortunately we live in a world where it is way more common than we think. So my husband and I decided to start trying. Figured, it would take a couple months. Just weren't really worried about it. No reasons to suspect that we would have issues. And we dealt with infertility and, went through infertility procedures. I've only ever gotten pregnant via IVF and got pregnant on our first round of IVF, and we were thrilled. And then I miscarried later, in about 7 weeks. I miscarried. And then, went on and kept doing this. And on our third round of IVF, got pregnant with our daughter, Colette. Made it past that first, scary first trimester, being on edge. I am not a great pregnant person, so I was sick all the time and, had some struggles, but was so thrilled to be pregnant and to finally be, on path, it seemed like, to bringing a baby home. When I was 21 weeks pregnant, something told me to go to the OB. And so I made an extra appointment, went to the OB, and there found out that my blood pressure was 188 over 110. And so just for reference, the normal range or the goal is 120 over 180. So, or 180 over
120 over 80.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Somehow those numbers were usually they roll off my tongue, and today they weren't. So, very scary time. And I was sent to labor and delivery and told I would be admitted until I delivered. And so, that was really just kind of like a shocking. I had severe preeclampsia. And so all of a sudden, everything kind of changed for us. Ultimately, I was in the hospital a little over 3 weeks, and then the doctors recommended delivery. And so delivered Colette 24 weeks and 5 days. And via emergency C-section, what ended up being they got her out quickly and got her situated and got her, up to the NICU and doing everything that they do. It was traumatic for me afterwards because they had issues putting my intestines back in after the C-section, and worked so long that actually my epidural wore off and I actually felt them working on me. So then I had to be put under. I mean, it was a whole thing. And then we spent 9 days in the NICU with Colette, with ups and downs and everything else. And then we lost her. And it's one of those things, and that was May of 2018. And so it's one of those things where it's coming up on 6 years, and there's so many things that feel so like they just happened, sometimes, and sometimes it feels like it's a lifetime ago, right? And so just kind of trying to move forward with that, trying to live a life of saying I am a mom. It just my child is not here, and what does that mean? And can we actually bring a child home? And all of those things that I think really just played into factor. And so we I basically that summer ran around and went to every potential doctor I could imagine seeing because I was convinced something was wrong with me and that if they could fix this one thing for me, everything would be fine. We could do it so over again, but with better results. And really what I found out was that nothing was really, there was nothing they could pinpoint. Even some of the risk factors of my age or weight or things like that were minor. And so, yeah, maybe it was a little bit of that, but it shouldn't be the whole thing. And so we started trying again, and we tried again naturally. And then we did another round of IVF that didn't take. And I really had to come to terms with that when it didn't take is that I felt a sense of relief that I wasn't pregnant again. And I really had to work through that on my own. Didn't share that with anybody for a few weeks. Really just sat with that. And then finally came to the conclusion of I was way too terrified to be pregnant again. And so told my husband I wanted to try surrogacy. And so we brought home our son via gestational carrier. So 100% our child. Um, and then, but somebody else carried. And that was a great experience for many reasons. One of which, probably the biggest of which, is that we brought him home and then also that we gained more family when you're talking about growing your family, and if you go through a surrogacy process that is I think even as half as wonderful as ours was, you gain more family through that process, right? And so we have somebody who was a stranger 5 years ago, who is now part of our family, and she and her partner and their kids are also part of our family, and that's a really beautiful thing as well. And so, yeah, and I think in all of this, after Colette died, one of the things that I had in my brain the whole way through was a financial piece. I was very blessed and very fortunate that we were okay financially, and I didn't have to worry about that. And I also recognized how special and how blessed I was to have that, and how many people didn't have that. And so I really took that to heart. And that was where we started. After she died, we started the nonprofit to provide financial assistance to these families in these crises. And so to date, we have helped in all 50 states. We have helped I think we're over 2,100 families right now. We might be close to 2,200, and given away over 1.4 million. And just really has been, through a lot of hard work and a lot of things. And then I think also just making people aware of so many issues of loss and of difficulty conceiving and of complications, NICU stays, all of that, I think is really important because I think there's a lot of unknowns and a lot of not talked about issues in that.
I think so too. I mean, I've known several people who got pregnant via IVF or had miscarriages or had babies in the NICU. And so it's definitely something that probably I don't know personally, but probably feels very lonely when you're
Mhm.
going through it.
Yeah, 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 for sure. Yeah, I mean, I still say that, it's the most isolating, experience to lose a child. It's, and it's isolating. It's sort of, my husband has said that it's, if you think people will get uncomfortable and they don't want to talk to you about it when you say you're going through infertility, then it's like, well, then when you have a loss, it's even less people and it's even less people. And, I think that that's really difficult to put a lot of that on people who are suffering already and going through grief, right? And sort of putting the onus on them to find people or to educate those in their lives who can be supportive. And I think that that's really difficult. And it's also a time where, not only does it feel isolating because people around you can't relate, it's also the time that people get really uncomfortable and leave. So I just have a friend who is just lost recently, and she and I were talking yesterday, and she was saying she's surprised by how many people she shared on social media, how many people unfriended her after she shared her loss, and and I had to talk to her and say, like, I get it. Yes, like I have friends who, have never really acknowledged it. So, they're not friends anymore. And that's also a really difficult time. So not only does it feel like just personally isolating, but it's also then you are feeling those effects of people who just can't handle it, or don't want you to talk about it or anything, who will just leave. And that's it's a horrible part of it. And I think that that's part of my mission personally is to keep talking about it and normalizing it and really bringing it out into the open so that we don't have those drastic drop-offs of people when somebody comes forward and says I had a loss, and that instead we have open arms saying I'm here whenever you need me, and that kind of thing. I think that's really important too.
I had no idea that was even a thing, that when you shared something like that, people would just disappear and unfriend you. That is absolutely appalling. I'm
Yeah,
so sorry.
yeah, and I think, I mean, right, I've heard a lot of not great things. I've heard a lot of horrible things. But I think the crickets, the nothing, is the most hurtful.
Mm.
And that's why I always say, show up and just be there, and it's okay. You don't have to have any magic words or solution because there aren't any. But showing up and being there and really getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's not really, I know it's not a topic people like to talk about. I get that. 6 years ago, I wouldn't have wanted to talk about this at all. Um, Nor did I think I was going to have to be. Um, it's still uncomfortable for me to know, right? I'm almost 6 years out. It's still uncomfortable for me to think I live in a world that one of my children is not in. And, you know, that's really difficult. But I can't shy away from the uncomfortableness. That's my life. And, for somebody who's supporting, it might be, a few minutes, an hour, a day that you have to kind of confront that. But then you get to go on with your life. And the lost parent has to continue living that. And so I think that that's also a really important part, that for as uncomfortable as it may be for people outside, it's just, it's a temporary time, and you have to think about, your loved ones and people in your lives who are going through that and living that every single day.
And I really like something you said earlier when you were talking. You said that, you had to move forward. You didn't say you had to move on. And I think there's a huge difference, and we say it the wrong way because when we have some kind of loss, whatever that might be, I mean, we don't want to have to move on and pretend that we never had that person or that thing that was really important in our lives or that relationship. We want to instead, still carry that as part of us, but be able to move forward and not be stuck in the present or in the past. So I think
Right.
that's is crucial to say that the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think, what we're seeing is really, I think we are of the first generation that's really openly talking about this, and saying for it, and coming forward and saying this. I think, I've heard stories now of, people older than me who have said, yeah, I had a loss. And then I was told, okay, you've mourned that. And now, like, you just shut that down and you don't talk about it
Mm.
again. I've had friends who have found out after their parents have died that they had another sibling. And then, all of those kinds of things of figuring out, how to say that. And I think I'm so grateful to be part of, a time in which people are saying, I'm not going to hide this. And, and I like to say at the top, I'm a mom of three, right? And you can only see one. But that doesn't take away from the fact that I'm a mom of two others. And, it's different, right? And it doesn't look like somebody else who would have three living children. It doesn't look the same. But, it's still very much the case. And I still very much operate from, I have three kids, and their needs are all different, and looking how I parent them is all different, but I have three kids. And that's, I think, something that's really powerful.
I agree. How did your losses affect maybe you personally and your different relationships that you have?
Yeah. Um, Me personally, I was a rule follower, a by the book person. I was really, I like to have things set up in ways, one of the things that the joke in my family was that I didn't let my gas tank go below half a tank of gas. I was very like particular about those kinds of things because I believed in some order and some like A plus B equals C kind of things. And, I I really changed a lot. And so all of a sudden, a lot of that hold that I had on it just didn't matter because I had followed every rule. I had done everything I was supposed to do, and this still happened. And so, it was very strange for me personally, and it was very strange for those around me who had been used to somebody who was, always doing it. So all of a sudden, being super on time for things and being early for things just didn't matter. And um, and I see that in my parenting. I'm some in a parent, and obviously I don't know what parenting a living child not after loss is like. But I find that, I'm good with mess, right? I think I'm blocking most of it, but our, room back here is very messy and, you know, I'm okay with that, right? And so figuring out those kinds of things, I think, has been a really interesting aspect. Then I think also too, it's like I love all the little moments of joy. So, every single thing. Just this morning, my son came into our room and cuddled in bed with us for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever it was. And that was great. That was a huge highlight of my day, right? And so those kinds of things I think are really important. Um, you know, in terms of relationships, I think it was difficult for a lot of people to have seen me as, one of the things that I think of all the time is I'm the planner of the family, right? Like I'm the one that people rely on and is on top of everything and kind of, knows how to take our emotions and put them off to the side to focus on this. And when Colette died, I had no idea how to plan her funeral. I didn't. I mean, I was a loss. And my sister showed up and, the next morning and showed up in a way and said, like, okay, you need to go and get dressed. And, really just provided those first steps of like, this is what you need to do. Okay, now we need to do this next. Okay, now we need to do this next kind of things. And I'm so grateful for that because for the first time in my life, I had no idea how to start, um, any of it. And so I think that was really, tough. And I think a lot of people around me having to realize I had been this one person for, you know, how old was I? 36 when Colette died. So, they had gotten used to me as this person. And all of a sudden for me to be like, okay. Little things just don't bother me in the same way. Um, and I think that was a huge shift for a lot of people around me. I did lose relationships, people who just um, couldn't deal with me, who wanted to come in and fix it all. And it was like, no, there is no fixing. People who wanted me to just not talk about it anymore. Um, all of that. I think um, there are people in my world that I became a lot closer to. One of the things I like to tell when people ask me, like, what should I do for my friend who lost is we had a friend who didn't show up in the immediacy, just didn't show up. And months later reached out to us and said, I am so sorry. I wanted to figure out how to best say it. I didn't want to, inundate you at first. And then I didn't know what to do. And then too much time had passed. And he was like, and then finally I just realized I'm gonna just say this and just apologize and tell you I didn't do what I should have done as a friend. Um, and he's one of our closest friends now, right? Like it's how it morphs and changes. And so I'm doing this. Um, my the closest people in the world to me are other lost parents. There is a bond that I have with them that is bigger than anything else. And that was a shift, right? So the people who were super important to me um, changed. And some of them because they basically made it known that they didn't want me to be talking about this or anything like that. And other people who were like, here, I'm here, and what do you need? Became closer. And so, I think that's a really big aspect of that feeling of loss of people leaving. And then also realizing you have people who are going to step up and you're going to meet new people and have these bonds and these important um, connections because they get it in a way that others don't.
And that makes sense. Some of the people that I'm closest to right now specifically have chronic pain. And just like, when you first become a parent, a lot of your really close friends become parents of kids
Right.
of about the same age.
Right.
So that definitely makes sense. And when you've got some kind of bond like that, it just draws people closer together.
Mhm.
So what about grief? Like, how did you manage your grief at the time, and how do you manage it now? Because I don't expect that the grief fully ever goes away.
No, no. Um, I mean, at the beginning, it's literally reminding yourself to, get out of bed and to take one step and then the other and then the other. And, you know, at some point you start to feel like I don't have to remind myself of every step along the way. And it starts to work. I get a lot of one of the things that always drives me crazy that people say is like, I can't even imagine. And it's like, I don't even, I can't even imagine, right? I'm 6 years out and I still sometimes have to stop and be like, how did I do that? Right? I don't know. Um, and how do I do it every day? I don't know. So I think, it's a lot of, doing this, it's a lot of realizing that it's an accomplishment if you get up and you get in the shower one day. That's an accomplishment sometimes. And if you don't, that's okay too. And then it becomes, with time, with, I was in individual therapy. My husband and I went to couples counseling. We found a support group, all of those things. With all of that and time and processing through that, it becomes a little bit easier, right? Every day. And then there are bad days, right? Just like you said with chronic pain. I mean, this is a chronic pain, right? So, there are days, right? And, it's the weather, it's the time of year. It's, May is a tough month for me to get through. Um, when I miscarried fully and did this the first time, that's very attuned to my body. And so May 17th is a really bad day for me. And my body tells me it's May 17th because we have that, that innate ability for our bodies to tell us these things. And, that's a tough day. And so, there are other things. There are other tough days that, really hurt, right? One of the things is I always thought I would be mom of two girls. And, you know, I know that I'm a mom of one girl, but it's not the way that I wanted to be a mom of a girl. And so what does that look like? And how do I live with that? And there are days where, I see two little girls out and there are days where that just makes me
Mm.
smile. And then there are days where that, can just completely upend me. And it doesn't, who knows why. Um, one of the things that I always talk about that was very interesting was that this happened in 2018, and in 2020 we elected our first female vice president, right? And that's a huge moment and a huge win and all of that. And I remember that really, truly affecting me and really just sobbing over it. And, thinking about all those things because I had wanted a daughter to share that with. And I didn't have a daughter in the way I thought to share with. And that, it's those things. So I think it's, really just figuring out the triggers that you can anticipate. And so like the anniversary dates, Colette's birthday, all of that. And then also realizing that you have to, you know that it might hit you out of nowhere, right? Something might happen and it's going to hit you out of nowhere. And what does that look like? And how do you cope with that? And how do you, give yourself the permission to feel that and then to move forward and to, take another step and do another day and all of that. I think that's all really important for me personally, with the starting the foundation, I became almost obsessive about starting it, so that we launched on Colette's due date in September.
Mhm.
And so a big part of that for me was that I didn't want to just have just the due date and just that sitting there. And so, I reshaped that day. And so, yes, it's a very, it's a sad day in a lot of ways for me, but it's also like a really um powerful, happy day because we made something out of it, right? So we're honoring Clint on that day. And yes, we're missing her, but we're also really honoring her memory and honoring her moving forward. And so that was really powerful for me. So I think, those kinds of things that you can do to make meaning out of days, I think is also really important.
Yeah, I really like that you found different types of support. So you found support in your sister, you found support in therapy, not just for, yourself, but for your husband as well, because I know it was really hard on him as well. And you also found a community of people,
Right.
and
Yeah.
that's really important. Plus, I love the fact that you turned something just completely tragic into something beautiful.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, and it's hard, right? It doesn't ever go away. And it's managing it and working with it. And I mean, that was one of the things I think we really connected over was the idea of the chronic nature of it, right? And so some days it's way more painful, and some days it's not as painful. And managing those highs and lows, and trying to grapple with, like, today was a tough day, and that doesn't mean that I'm back to what it was in the very beginning, even though some of those days do feel like it, right? And knowing that it's okay, and take the time to work through whatever that is that's happening, and then figure out a path to move forward, and to perhaps better understand before you're in that,
Mhm.
and how do you protect yourself? How do you work through that? I think those are all really important things.
And that's a good point, being prepared ahead of time, knowing that you're going to have some bad days, as is with, any kind of grief and loss. I am generally pretty joyful most of my days because I've processed and I've worked through my grief of having chronic pain and losing my career and losing a lot of my functionality. But I do still have days where it just really sucks and
Mhm.
it's really hard and I can't get out of bed because I'm just so miserable and so depressed that this is a chronic thing that I'm probably going to have my whole life. But, being prepared ahead of time and, like you said, realizing that in those days you're not back to the beginning.
Right.
I think that's a great point.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think it's regrouping, and you don't have to do it in the moment, right? Like, feel what you need to feel, right? So
Mhm.
have the day that you need to stay in bed, to the extent that you can, right? Do whatever you need to do to protect yourself, and then when you're past that moment in time, really reflect back and say, okay, now I see, like, yeah, I was kind of dragging myself. I wasn't really getting enough sleep. I haven't really been taking care of myself in, any fashion. And so, yeah, I was beat down, physically, and then also with grief on top of it. Or recognize there are times of year, that are not great. Last year, I referred to May 17th, and that, for me, I think that's because it was my body was going through this, and I went through this completely alone just because of circumstance, of when it happened. But recognizing that that's a really tough day, and last year it was a terrible day. And so
Mhm.
my husband was like, let's put it into our calendar, and so we know, and we don't schedule anything for you. And he feels that day on a very different level, and so for him that doesn't really factor in. And I understand it because it happened in my body while I was alone. Um, and did that. So, like, those kinds of things are really great to remember and to appreciate, and to just say, this is not my best day. And so can I just block out this day that I don't plan anything extra? And so all I have to deal with is just getting through that day or that week or that whatever. Those kinds of things I think are really important.
I agree. And I like that you listen to your body and you know that because our bodies remember our traumas and our past and all the terrible things that have happened physically, emotionally, whatever. And so I think it's really great that you're honoring that day and honoring your body and your heart and your mind as well by just keeping that day sacred.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. And recognizing the difference, right? Like I have a couple of days that are terrible for me. That one in particular is directly attuned to what was happening with my body physically. And so that day over other days feels really intense and painful for me. And, I remember a couple of years ago, um, probably right in, the heart of parenting, I hadn't really paid attention to the day it was, right? And and then all of a sudden I was like, my body is like tingling and like just very aware and tense and all this stuff. And I was like, what is going on? And I couldn't explain it. And then it occurred to me what day it was. And I was like, oh, so my body reminded me what day it was.
Yeah.
And that's, it happens, right? And I think, especially for those of us who have carried this kind of, physicalness of the grief, it's tough, right? And it's so important to honor that feeling, to do that and to have the tears, to have the day that getting out of bed is not happening or um, it's happening, but very carefully and very unlike yourself. And that's okay.
Mm.
And I think all of that is really important.
Yeah, I agree. So on parenting, one of probably my worst fear in the world is somehow, something happening to my child. She's 11 now, and every time there's an Amber Alert, the first thing I do is pray and I check and see if that the next day, see if that child has been found. And I had a niece who committed suicide. I think she was about 17. So there are lots of ways that you can lose a child. You lost yours very, 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 very young. Do you find yourself being overprotective with your son, or how's that kind of
Oh
affecting
yeah.
you with him? Yeah.
Yeah. For sure. I mean, I think, right, every parent fears something happening with their child, right? That's just
Hmm.
the nature of parenting. Um, I think when you have experienced the loss, then it's not, it no longer becomes this like, well, this could happen, or what if this happened? It becomes like, okay, so this happened, and
Hmm.
could it happen again? And the complete fear of that. Um, and so, yes. So, do I automatically go to the worst case scenario every single time? Yes. Am I super, super careful with, um, letting him be a kid and do all the things? And of course, my son is fearless and, all of that. And so you don't want to be that parent that's, constantly being like, no, 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 all that. But you also are very careful of that. Um, and so, it's really difficult because, and I think this is where I always say, finding your community and your group, your support that can understand this is, my son just started preschool in um, September, and so I guess not just started, but and we dropped him off his first day, and of course he cried and did the whole thing, and um, I was home, and all of a sudden my phone rang, and my phone doesn't ring all that often anymore, and I looked down, and it was the preschool calling me, and as I was answering it, my first thought was, "You're calling to tell me my son is dead."
Mm.
And, that's probably not a reaction most parents have. And it turned out to be innocent, right? It was this teacher who very nicely was calling to let us know how he was doing and checking in with us and all of that. But that initial call, I mean, it took me a little while to sort of get down from that, eh, the adrenaline of, oh my God, we're back here and what happened and all of that, was really hard to do. We also, right, because sometimes I think the universe just thinks, well, if you can handle one thing, let's throw a couple of the other things on it just to make it fun. Elliot was born in the middle of COVID in July 2020. he entered the world. And so we were panic stricken about all of this. And I think one thing that I have found in sort of the baby loss community is, those things that are supposed to provide us comfort, like this doesn't happen, this only happens in like 1% of cases, or, all of that. All of those things that are supposed to provide us comfort for people who have gone through baby loss, oftentimes they were part of that small percentage. And so those things are no longer comforting. And in fact, can actually be really triggering, right? So it's like, so that was one thing, one of the reasons why we ended up changing pediatricians was that I was really upset by something she said at our 6-month visit. I was getting very paranoid about COVID, and there wasn't a vaccine for him yet, and there wasn't a vaccine. He was first eligible for now is a vaccine at 6 months, but he was first eligible and he was 23 months. And so, it was almost 2 years of really isolation and trying to keep him and being terrified all the time and all of that. And so I mentioned to her and I said, I'm really concerned, and like, what other things can I do? And just kind of doing this. And she went through this whole thing about how it didn't really affect babies and infants and, all of this. And she said, on the rare case, and kind of went through all this. And I listened to her. And then I said, that's really great, but given our history, that doesn't provide me any comfort. And her response was, yeah, I know. And then went on. And sort of left me with like okay, well, that's great that you acknowledge that, but like, help me here, help me process this, help me work through this. And so we switched pediatricians, and, largely that was a big part of it, right? There were other things involved too. And I just don't think she meshed with our family. But that was really hard because I needed somebody to tell me, not those things you would tell everybody else, but I needed somebody to sit there and to say with me, like, okay, but these are the things you are doing that are protective. And like, yes, we can't allow for everything, but this is what you're doing. Are there other things that, you would feel better if we talked through some things, or whatever that would have looked like? And it could have been a variety of different things. But that was helpful for me. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's constant fear of doing things. It's things like he went through a period of time where he was wide awake at 4 a.m. every morning, right? And we hated it, and it was tough, and we were exhausted. But when we, kind of adjusted some things and he slept until 6:30, that day was thrilling when we woke up and it was like, oh, it's like 6 o'clock instead of, it's 3:50. And it was exciting, but it was also terrifying because it was like, okay, is he asleep and is this okay, or did something happen? And I think that that's really tough. And also wanting to give him the normal childhood of falls and all of that, is a difficult balance to strike.
Yeah, I know a lot of parents, myself included, go through that balancing act between letting your kids have a normal childhood and protecting them from things you can protect them from. But after losses like you've had, I imagine it would just be on a whole other level than what most parents go through.
Right. Yeah. And I think really what I have found is it's the initial like thought, the initial, oh my God, this is unsafe, is pretty common among most parents. What is different is that it's the taking that and running through all the scenarios until something has happened, right?
Mm.
And so I'm thinking of like, over the summer we did a play date with a friend, and we then went from the park over to get something to eat. And when we were coming back, major intersection to cross, and we were waiting for the light, and he took one step off the curb onto the street. Now, granted, it was fine, it was safe, and I grabbed him, pulled him back. He was fine. Now, I was very hysterical, and sort of was more, I'm not really a yeller towards him, but I was a little bit more like forceful about the importance of that. Yes, every parent, and I just saw your look, kind of was like, oh my God, like that moment, right? Every parent has that moment, but the problem is that what I had was that I saw him stepping off of it, and I saw a semi truck coming through and hitting him and killing him. I went all the way through that in the seconds it took me to pull him back and then to tell him you cannot do that, right? And so those are the kinds of things that I think are difficult. It's scary for any parent that one step, the one thing that they do, where you're like, oh, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. But I think it's even worse because then it's taking that and running all the way to the end to say, this is what's going to happen. And not being able to necessarily separate out and say, just because you took that one step does not mean it goes all the way to the end. And I think that's the difference.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So what advice do you have for parents, whether or not they've lost a child? You said a lot of really good things. So what do you think your big piece of advice might be?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always coming from a place of love, and really just letting that be your guiding post. I think, I took a course and I sort of scoffed at this at first, but I think it was really important. She says, come up with a parenting mission statement, and really sit with that and see that, and let yourself go back to that, right? One of the things that is in our parenting mission statement is to raise kids who question the status quo and who advocate for change. And so it's helpful for me because when my son starts to argue back with me a little bit or test his boundaries, right, as frustrating as that is for a parent, I also want my kid to be that adult and that teenager who does that, right? And so I think that that's a really important piece. In terms of law, I think um, we're at a point in our world where I think a lot of parents are really figuring out how to best explain other families and how families don't look like each other's. And I think you know for parents who are doing that great work, keep doing it. And I think I would just include also as well as saying this loss piece, right? That my son's siblings are very different than what we are used to. And that's okay. And they're very different than a family that might have, there might be stepchildren or adopted children or any of that. And that's okay, right? There's nothing wrong with that. That's just different families. Because I think that that's really important too, is to recognize those differences. And if you're not doing the work to explain other families, do it like now. Just make that, because I think that's really important um, to let our kids know, and to normalize that your family looks one way, but that's not how every family looks, and that's okay. And in fact, that's good because then we have a lot of different families. For lost parents, I give you a big virtual hug. And I tell you that it's not easy. And wherever you are in your loss, and whether that is you have another child at home or you don't, and what that looks like, uh, I get it. It sucks. It all sucks, right? I think that one of the things that I always love to tell people is, um, bringing home a child was wonderful and amazing, and all of this stuff. And it also was super triggering, right?
Mm.
And it was also made a lot of things more heightened and worse. And that is all happening at the same time that the rest of the world is kind of looking at you like, oh, so now you're good, right? And you're like, no, I'm not. Where did anything that I said make you think that I was okay? And and I think balancing those two things is tough. And um, how do you do that? And how do you let that know? Um, and at the end of the day, we're all doing our best that we possibly can. And if you are at 40% one day and you give that 40%, you've given 100% of you and who you were at that day in that moment. And I think that's really important. I think, we all as parents need to give ourselves permission. And I say that myself included, right? I say that, and there are days I have where I'm like, I didn't do this and I didn't do that and all that. And just reminding yourself that you're doing the best you can on every single day. And that means you're giving 100% of yourself. And that's okay. Also, there's no work-life balance. I just want to say
Yeah.
that. Like, just take those words out of your mouth. There is no balance. And stop trying to attain it because it just doesn't happen. And yeah,
Yeah, I don't like the term work-life balance either. I heard it called work-life integration one time, and I like that a lot better because
right,
everybody's quote unquote balance is going to look differently.
right. Yeah, I think I believe it's Nora Roberts, and if it's not, then my apologies to the universe and to whoever actually said it, who talks about that it's juggling balls and that you have
Mm,
things and um a lot of them are plastic, and so you are going to drop them, and that's okay. And then there are some that are glass, and those you don't want to drop. And sometimes they are home and family and work. Plastic balls are going to drop, and sometimes they are work balls and family stuff is going to drop. And I think all of that. I think I like to think that a lot is to is to really sit there and think and like, okay, what are today's or this week's or this month's glass balls? What do I really need to
mm.
be like on top of? And to recognize that it's sometimes going to be home and it's sometimes going to be work and it's sometimes going to be both. And trying to just give yourself the permission that like things are going to drop because you cannot be in multiple places at the same time. It just isn't going to happen. And that's something that you just have to work through and deal with.
I also really like what you said about if you're at 40% one day and you give that 40%, you've given 100% of yourself.
Right,
Because when you have, any kind of issue in your life, including chronic health issues and pain and fatigue and, depression and anxiety, all of these other things too, it's hard. It's probably impossible to be at 100% every day.
right.
I know I'm not. And it just makes me personally feel better to hear you say that because now that you've said that, I resonate with that and I agree with that.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. I like that.
Of course. Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I was thinking of, I had a friend who, right around the anniversary of her loss, with her living children, was like, I'm just not showing up as a mother. Like the other day, I just brought them into bed with me and we watched movies in bed all day. And, was complaining about this. And, she's saying this. And then finally I said, do you understand? Your kids probably thought you were the coolest mom. And like, you're beating yourself up over it, but that didn't register for them. That was an issue. And I think reframing that and remembering those kinds of things is really important, right? What kid wouldn't want a parent who is like, hey, today we're gonna just watch movies all day, right? Um, so do it and just, go with it and let it be okay. Um, and, uh, yeah.
Awesome. Where can we get more information about your foundation?
Sure. So our website is Colette is one L and two T's, Louise.com. And then we are the same on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or X. I don't know what it is now. Link. But we are on all of those platforms and yeah, would love to share more and to be there. On our social media, we share a lot of information about how to best support a lost parent and all of that. And I think that's all really helpful, useful on knowledge if you are experiencing that and, dealing with people who are experiencing that as well.
Great. Thank you for what you do. And thank you for coming on.
Yes, thank you for having me. So.
Make sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any health, parenting, or life advice. For my freebie 30 ways to relieve pain without taking a pill, go to ithurtstomom.com/tips. If you have comments, suggestions, or want to be on this podcast, email me at ithurtstomom@gmail.com. I wish everybody a blessed and pain-free day.